It's just kind of reached this scale which competes with other traditional forms of generation.
Can you put a figure on that? What are we talking about when we talk about the size of the market? And what does that mean in the context of electricity in general in the UK? We're basically saying if all batteries were doing was keeping lights on, at any one time on average, they can keep the lights on in about a tenth of all of Britain's homes.
And also, if we look at that 3 gigawatt number, what's interesting is that that's pretty sort of globally leading.
Is that what we've seen as being the main market for batteries so far?
The thing that makes batteries so good at this, and it's why they've kind of displaced all the other technologies which were providing this service, is that they can do it so quickly and so accurately.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Modo the podcast. We've got something a little bit different for you today. In this special episode, Neil is hosting and he's talking to our markets lead, Wendell Hortop. Neil and Wendell take a look at the build out so far, what batteries are doing in the markets, and what changes might we expect to see in the future as more capacity comes online. As always, if you are enjoying the podcast, please like and subscribe. It really means the world to us. And if you want to see more content from the Modo team, follow us on LinkedIn. Let's jump in.
Hi, Wendell. For those who don't know, Wendell is Modo's very own markets lead. And today I'm going to be asking Wendell a few questions about the Great British battery market and sort of what batteries do and the size of that market and what it might look like in future. But before we start, Wendell, it might just be worth you introducing yourself and telling us a bit about what makes you qualified to talk about this topic in particular.
Yeah, hi Neil. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I've been at Modo market lead for the last 8-9 months. But before that was sort of been working in the battery space within what we'd call an optimizer. So essentially that's these companies that have the software that controls battery storage. And so that's a company called Open Energy. I was there for 4.5 years, which really has sort of spanned, I think, the growth of battery storage from what it was at that point, which was very small, which I think we'll come on to where we are today, which is pretty significant in the realm of both the UK but also kind of globally if we look at battery markets.
And so if we just dive into it, I often hear people say Britain's battery market is mature. What do people mean when they say that Britain's battery market's mature?
There's a few different sort of things that's referring to. I think the first is just that when we look at the scale of new battery projects that are now coming into the market, if you think about the size of them, they are equivalent to other energy infrastructure. It's sort of now we're at what we call hundreds of megawatts scale. So it's kind of, we're seeing new batteries on the scale as you would build, say, a small gas plant or a small sort of other generation unit. So that's one way that the market's matured, is it's just kind of reached this scale which kind of competes with other traditional forms of generation. I think secondly, it's more on the market side, on the regulation side, what is set up today in the sort of Great British market compared to a lot of other markets, say in Europe. Batteries are a recognized sort of form of energy infrastructure. You can go and build a battery, you can trade it in the markets, you can access all the other markets which sort of other generation can access. And so that's the second way in which it's a mature industry. You can actually kind of have a battery which competes with this other form of generation. And I think finally, it's just the kind of companies which are now kind of in the space, the companies that are investing in these assets and looking at these assets. You've now got kind of big energy majors, the kind of more traditional kind of generation companies who are building renewables, building kind of sort of energy infrastructure at scale, now looking at battery storage as an investment opportunity.
Cool. And so you talked about there a little bit the size of the market. Can you put a figure on that? What are we talking about when we talk about the size of the market, and what does that mean in the context of electricity in general in the UK?
Yeah, so quite recently we've hit sort of 3 gigawatts of grid scale battery storage capacity in the UK. And that's talking about the kind of power that these things can actually contribute to the grid, not necessarily the energy capacity behind them. It's probably about 3.5 gigawatt hours of energy capacity. To put that into context, sort of peak demand in the UK in Great Britain hits about 48 gigawatts, but we've got average demand, which is probably more about 35 gigawatts. So it's now at a pretty sizable level in comparison to the rest of the sort of the GB market and the GB electricity system.
So like just thinking about those numbers, so an average time, we're basically saying like if all batteries were doing was keeping lights on, at any one time on average, they can keep the lights on in about a tenth of all of Britain's homes.
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at like kind of peak, let's say like winter peak demand, then battery storage on its own during that like peak period could provide like 8-10% of that consumption.
Okay, and so who's actually got us to this stage then? Who's been building these batteries? Where's this 3 gigawatts come from?
I think that's what's so interesting about battery storage in Great Britain. I mean, if we look at sort of other markets worldwide who are sort of roughly comparable, we've got like the US and China really. In the US, a lot of it's been kind of much more established sort of companies who are building this technology. Like in California, they're building like, huge batteries in order to replace essentially like gas peaking plant. But what we've seen in the UK is this kind of grow from a series of what were very small batteries at the time in the scheme of things. So we're talking about things which are like 1 megawatt to 5 megawatts in size, whereas now the stuff going in is like 100 megawatts. The companies who have been responsible for that have therefore kind of been able to have sort of wanted to and been able to follow that growth. Because of that small scale we had originally, we've sort of seen a lot of what you would have thought would have been the more kind of traditional companies to be building and owning the sort of battery storage kind of weren't really that interested. Like they could go and build a much bigger project, like a much bigger offshore wind farm or a much bigger solar farm or gas plant if they really wanted to. So instead, we've seen a kind of lot more of it's more kind of private, like kind of very sophisticated sort of companies who are like specialists in battery storage and want to build this technology, want to own it and see like the long-term value of it. And also, I mean, if we look at that 3 gigawatt number, what's interesting is that that's pretty sort of globally leading. I think the only countries which have got more are probably China and the US. And they're obviously much, much bigger sort of countries with a lot like larger electricity consumption, electricity generation than we have in the UK. For the size of the grid, we've got a kind of we've managed to do pretty well in terms of the scale of battery storage.
So you've mentioned there the people who got us here and the organisations that got us here, almost like these kind of disruptive private equity firms, not your incumbent big infrastructure builders and energy majors. Has there been like, in order to get us to that huge like 3 gigawatt number, has there been like a lot of government input? Are we seeing subsidies, policies that are friendly towards batteries? Is that how we've got here?
No, and I think that's what's so impressive about what has happened in the UK is that essentially we've hit this level where we're now seeing batteries kind of compete with other incumbent generation and sort of essentially be its own infrastructure without any sort of dedicated government support. So there's not been any sort of specific subsidies aimed at battery storage or kind of storage in general. So it's been kind of done entirely based on what these companies are willing to sort of expect from the market. And that's very different to when we look at renewable generation, which has grown to such significant levels, but it's been done with kind of quite heavy backing from the government.
Okay, you touched on the markets there. And like the first thing anyone says when you speak to them about battery energy storage, right, is that the sun doesn't always shine, wind doesn't always blow. So the idea is batteries will kind of take that excess energy when it's there, buy it cheap. And then when it's not there and prices are high, they'll resell it. So is that what we've seen as being the main market for batteries so far?
In short, no. So most of what has gotten us to where we are today is sort of essentially batteries competing for this thing called frequency response. And so that's just where they're helping keep the grid stable. It's these contracts they can go and get from sort of National Grid ESO. And so they're paid to provide this service to the grid. And they are, that has been by far the biggest contribution to what batteries have sort of been looking to do and looking to contribute and looking to earn revenues from.
And so you say frequency response. Could you just tell us what frequency response is and kind of what makes batteries so suited to providing this service?
So frequency of the grid has to be kind of maintained at 50 hertz in the UK. It can kind of drift either way, and that's sort of naturally what happens when, so if sort of the available generation on the grid starts to exceed supply, we'll see frequency increase, and when the opposite happens, we'll see frequency fall. But it's very important in order for that to be kind of kept within this narrow band around 50 hertz. And so what frequency response is doing is essentially it's just providing like the opposite action to whatever's pushing frequency in that direction. And the thing that makes batteries so good at this, and it's why they've kind of just displaced all the other technologies which were providing this service, is that they can do it so quickly and so accurately, compared to like any other kind of technologies out there. Frequency changes very, very quickly, and batteries are able to respond to that in less than a second. And so, if there's it happens quite frequently, like an interconnector to Norway trips, and all of a sudden, 1 gigawatt of batteries like kind of pick up that slack and like correct for that imbalance in the grid.
So far, that's kind of where batteries have earned most of their money, is providing this frequency response, and the money that National Grid has provided in those markets. Is that still the case, and has that changed at all? And if it has, why?
So the last few years have been probably quite interesting to look at. So I think before last year, the industry was kind of getting ready to move away from frequency response. Everyone you talked to was saying like, like kind of energy trading is the future, or the balancing mechanism, or these other markets which you can go into. But then the price of this kind of one of these contracts, this sort of one of these frequency response contracts, essentially went through the roof. And so all batteries wanted to kind of provide this service, and were doing so for essentially the entirety of last year. And really that just happened because the demand for that service couldn't be met by what was available from batteries that existed. Now, what we've seen happen since then is there's been a flood of sort of new capacity which has come in to the market, kind of, well, I think a lot of it was planned, but also kind of accelerated in response to those really high prices. And now we've got the opposite. We've got kind of too much supply for kind of the demand of that service. And so prices have really kind of collapsed. They've fallen about 90% since. And so if batteries can no longer get what they were earning from kind of delivering that frequency response service, they're instead looking to other markets. And so the kind of most common one would just be sort of like wholesale trading. And so that'd be buying. So it goes back to your example you started with. So buying energy when, say, demand's low overnight, or when it's really sunny during the middle of the day, and selling this energy at the peak where prices are at their highest and demand is highest.
And so has that had to lead to like a kind of shift in expectations, and this idea of like, if batteries are earning loads of money doing this frequency response last year, and I think it's something like over £150,000 per megawatt annually for batteries in Britain, and most of that, as you said, coming from frequency response, has the idea of success changed? Has the definition of success for batteries commercially changed?
I think that, those involved in the industry, those who are building these batteries, they should be looking at what the market as it is today is what they were probably expecting to see when they built those batteries and when they agreed to build those batteries. What happened last year was kind of just a really unexpected sort of boon for the industry, but companies shouldn't have been looking at that as like a reliable long-term benchmark for what they could earn. And I think really where we are now is back where we were back before that started. So if we go back kind of 3 years, we're now at comparable levels again in terms of what you can actually earn with a battery.
And that's still good, right? Like if we look at like, I assume it's still good anyway, because we look at like the pipeline of the amount of people who are attempting to build big batteries right now. These people, if they're not getting government subsidies for it, really. So they must be looking at the market and going, this is still good.
Yeah, and I think that's what, it's definitely the case. We've got a sort of huge pipeline of new batteries which are trying to kind of come online as quickly as possible. Every sort of week we're seeing a new battery come online, sort of 50 megawatts, 100 megawatts in scale. And I think, really it's because they can look at the market where it was today and sort of the fundamentals of that. And they see that they can kind of generate value from that for the duration of the project. But I think the other thing that's important about battery storage, which we saw in kind of late 2021, is that the kind of outside of those frequency response markets, we would expect kind of energy markets in general to get more volatile as we kind of go through this net zero transition. So as renewable generation kind of picks up in capacity, as of the old sort of thermal, so gas powered or coal powered generation kind of retires, we will naturally see swings in the kind of wholesale market increase. And so back at the end of 2021, we saw kind of a period of low wind, which coincided with kind of low availability from, say, nuclear, and prices just went through the roof, and sort of batteries could make back a sort of big portion of their expected revenues just in, say, a week or 2 weeks. And that's operating in the wholesale market. That's not kind of providing frequency response. So I think a lot of the companies who are investing, they like kind of where they see a sort of baseline of revenues, But the thing that kind of makes them interested in the space, I think, is really the fact that, things can get a lot higher quite quickly, and the fundamentals which are going to cause that are probably just going to make it more and more likely to happen as we go forwards.
Well, yeah, it's that thing. I think I saw a statistic, and it's not Britain, but in Texas, 99% of battery revenues were made in 50 days, right? Yeah. Because of exactly that. On certain days you get those spreads, and that's really where batteries are really well placed as a technology class to kind of take advantage. But anyway, where do you see the market's going? What do you see as the future for batteries in Great Britain?
So I think frequency response is still going to play a big part. There's always going to be a requirement for that from National Grid, sort of probably about 1 to 2 gigawatts. But the thing is, we're now at 3 gigawatts of battery storage. We're going to get to 4 gigawatts maybe by the end of the year, 10 gigawatts by sort of 2028, 2027, 2028. What is the rest of that battery storage going to be doing? Because it's not going to be doing frequency response. And so I think just the way that batteries operate in kind of wholesale markets, the way they look to trade energy, is naturally going to evolve. I think as they spend more time sort of in those trading markets, you'll see sort of strategies looking more at trading within day. You'd hope that they would take more of a role in the balancing mechanisms, so essentially helping the control room kind of sort of maintain the kind of ongoing stability of the system. But also there's kind of other markets which we expect to see. So there's a kind of few new products coming at the end of the year, which I think batteries will look to take part in.
So, I mean, it all sounds very exciting, and obviously it is, right? Because otherwise the sort of like investment in the space that we're seeing wouldn't be happening. What's your contrarian viewpoint on all of this that kind of goes against the assumed logic that we use all the time in the Modo office and outside?
I think for me, it's that I think even for us, like kind of in the industry, I think it's easy to like lose sight of how quickly things are kind of changing and evolving. Kind of 5 years ago, batteries could not even they couldn't participate in the balancing mechanism. They weren't recognized as a source of kind of generation you could trade with. Whereas when you look at it now, you kind of take that for granted. And so I think what that tells us is that things which we think are barriers in terms of like maybe policy, they can quickly change. And I think once they do change, like batteries have got a long way that they can contribute to the grid.
You are right. It's moved incredibly quickly, and the pace only really seems to be picking up, to be honest. But is there any like cause for concern and things we need to watch where like not everything's necessarily super rosy?
It's a good question. I think, when we look at the pipeline that exists of sort of new batteries that people want to build, you can see it's there. You can see the appetite's there. I think what we're going to start seeing more and more is, this issue of connections come to the fore. So can you actually connect that to the grid? I think that's a big focus, not just of the industry, but much wider. Like how do we get the amount of new renewable capacity onto the grid that we need? And the other thing is, I think it's kind of just, can we get the kit, get the equipment? Are we going to see the supply chain able to grow? Are we going to see Great Britain still kind of be an attractive place to supply to in comparison to, say, the US? So, can you actually get these batteries on the ground? And I think we hope so. And I think that's what that massive pipeline helps is that there's going to be a lot of demand for this going forward.
Yeah, it's sort of proof of concept, right? That's the point in people saying Great Britain's a mature market. We've sort of proved the concept. And you would hope that what that means is that the supply chain remains relatively reliable. But it's yet to be seen. And yeah, as you said, there's competition elsewhere, and not just from other geographies, but electric vehicles and all sorts of other things.
I think one thing that will help that is when we look at the scale of batteries that's going forward, they're getting bigger. We've had 100 megawatts systems coming online sort of over the last year or two. But in a few years, there'll be 200 megawatts, 300 megawatts. Like there's this one that just got announced, which is 1 gigawatt. Wait to see when it actually kind of is built. But that scale of project makes it much easier to kind of get over some of these barriers.
A gigawatt sounds absolutely crazy, right? When you think back to like that Leighton Buzzard battery being 6 megawatts, and now we're talking like 150, 200 times bigger than that. So yeah, absolutely insane. But anyway, thank you for taking the time to talk to us, Wendell. It's been super insightful. So yeah, thanks a lot.
See you, Neil.